just in preparation for our next panel, in terms of the cards for your questions and comments, we will have someone from the Sachs Institute. Could you raise your hand there, Ryan, and Michelle, thank you, Michelle, who have baskets a bit like church. So if what you could do is when you have a question or comment, all you have to do is just raise them, and Michelle and Ryan will be watching all of you, and that way we'll be collecting them in an ongoing way rather than getting them at the end. We will end promptly at 12:30. At 12:30, Dr. Kaslow has an announcement that she would like to make. And then we will have a 15-minute break. At 12:45, we will have the presentation by Chief Thomas and Deputy Chief Adams about the crisis intervention work here on campus. That will end promptly at 1:15, and then we will begin the afternoon session at 1:30. So we'll go till 12:30, then Dr. Kaslow will have an announcement to make, then we'll have our break, and then the presentation, and then begin again at 1:30. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Steve. Welcome to our panel discussion. Our program's titled, Even Kansas Isn't Kansas Anymore, Cultural Competence in the Assessment and Treatment of Campus Mental Illness. We believe the title reflects the changing American landscape and the issues that we'd like to discuss with you today. My name's Emil Rodolfa. I'm a professor at California School of Professional Psychology, and I was the director of the Counseling Center at the University of California, Davis, and retired from that job, that stressful job, last year. I'd like to introduce our panel to you, and then they will say a little bit more about themselves in a minute. Dr. Farah Abbasi, who's a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, core faculty in the Muslim Studies program, staff psychiatrist at the Olin Health Center for Students at Michigan State University. Dr. Kirstyn Chun, who's a clinical psychologist and associate counselor faculty at Counseling and Psychological Services, California State University, Long Beach. Dr. Elizabeth Gong-Guy, who's the president of the Association for University and College Counseling Center Directors and the executive director at the Counseling and Psychological Services at UCLA. And she's an associate clinical professor at the UCLA Department of Psychology. Dr. Reina Juarez, who's the director of Counseling and Psych Services at the University of California, San Diego. Brenda Ibanez, who's a student in political science and human resources at California State University, Long Beach. And Carla Shird, who's the coordinator of services and a mental health counselor at the Mental Health Center at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. I'd like to frame our panel discussion for you, and in a few moments our panel will introduce themselves to you. We thought it was important for you to hear from them a little about their identities and what they hope to convey to you today. After these brief introductions, we'll begin to discuss a number of questions that our panel developed, and I'll ask a question, and they'll share their wisdom. We hope that you will join in this discussion, as Steve said, by writing a question and holding it up, and somebody will come and pick it up and bring it up. And so we will use less of our questions and more of your questions. By the way, we've provided you a resource page, which is on the table in the lobby. So I'd like to turn it over to the panel and let them introduce themselves to you.
Hi, everyone. I am so glad to be here today. Just found out that Michigan had 7 inches of snow. So besides that, I'm really, really excited for the work SEC Institute is doing. And I'm really honored to share the table with all these established women here. I work at Student Health Center, and my area of I like to call myself a cultural psychiatrist. I have designed the cultural psychiatry curriculum for my residency, and I also work with Muslim mental health. So I'm a director of a conference, Muslim Mental Health Conference, and managing editor for a journal of Muslim mental health. I would just say one thing is there is no cookie cutter solution for any problem. I'm always trying to teach about diversity within the diversity. We sometimes tend to oversimplify things and just put labels and call someone even the Muslim thing, like if they assume like all the Muslims are the same, or Muslim means certain things. So I always want to caution the providers, the mental health providers, to always be cognizant of the fact that every person is an individual. A small thing is, if I'm prescribing Zoloft, I can run through all the side effects and tell you to expect this, but I always, in the end, emphasize that. But still, I do not know how it's going to affect you in person. So always understanding that part of the treatment, I think, is the most important thing. Thank you.
So let me just frame and give you this question that I said I was going to do, and I didn't.
And I answered it before.
Yeah, and you answered, but I want to make sure everybody does. What would you like a student, a school administrator, or a counseling center psychologist to take away from this panel regarding intersecting identities and campus mental health issues?
I'm Kirstyn Chun. I am a clinical psychologist at Cal State Long Beach's Counseling Center, and I guess the three things that I would really hope to share or look forward to speaking on are, one, the practice guidelines. The APA and some other organizations have this as well, but on the resource sheet at the back of the room, for example, number 3, there have been revised practice guidelines for working with gay and lesbian and bisexual clients. And then I'm really excited to say that Division 44, the LGBT division of APA, is coming out with practice guidelines for transgender clients. And in fact, the Office of LGBT Concerns is accepting comments on that. So absolutely, if you have questions or concerns or comments or feedback that you'd like to share, you can contact them or ask me how to contact them. I'd be happy to speak with that. And I really, I try to specialize in LGBT issues, and I say try because I feel like that's a lifelong learning process, but I really appreciate the practice guidelines and the resources and referrals that come from there, and I hope that can be of use to you all as well, especially because graduate education and training is still working on being as comprehensive in that regard as it needs to be. 2 other things really quickly. I was reflecting on awareness of privilege, meaning the areas of our lives in which things might be naturally easier for us. For example, I was raised Catholic, so I never have to worry about not having to work on a holiday of mine, but then also on areas where I feel perhaps marginalized. So in my LGBT identity, or my person of color identity, or my female gender identity. And I feel like privilege is something that's harder to talk about with cultural competence, but I think that it's sort of like exercise, use it or lose it, and it's something that we all, including myself, have to commit to and work towards every day. And the third thing I wanted to mention, especially for this population, is the importance of community resources and engagement with community advocacy groups. So for many LGBT clients, there's such feelings of isolation, and especially even within your own family most of the time. So for us as therapists to constantly be trying to learn more about different community resources, both locally and nationally. So those are the 3 things that I wanted to mention for now. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me be here, Ellen. Thank you so much. My name is Brenda Ibanez, and I'm a student at Cal State University Long Beach. I guess what I would most like for you guys to take with you is that mental illness is not something that just affects the individual. It affects everyone that we come in contact with, starting with our parents. I believe that with a a group of people, such as the panel and yourselves that are interested in this subject, I think that mental illness stigma will be taken away eventually, and that we will be seen as citizens of this nation that need help, and not to be identified as people who cannot function in society. I've been able to, granted I'm 43, and I'm working on my bachelor's degree, but I'm doing it. And just as I'm doing it, if you have loved ones or you know of people with mental illness, that through your support and guidance, that can be done for each and every one of us. And I guess just don't give up. Don't give up trying to help us, because some of us do make it. Thank you.
My name's Liz Gong-Guy, and I am, as Dr. Rodolfa indicated, at UCLA, and happy about it. Proud, actually. And I've been at the Counseling Center for 2.5 decades and feel really enormously privileged to have been there, and now today to be here speaking to all of you and on this distinguished panel. I have been a counseling psychologist, a clinical psychologist actually the entire time, and have directed the center and have actually seen enormous change over the course of the 2.5 decades that I've been on our campus. And I think one of the most striking changes has been the effectiveness, no, we'll go the other way, has been how much more likely students of different identities have been increasingly willing to come into the counseling center. We served last year 6,800 of our 41,000 students in clinical services. It's about 18% of the students who are eligible to come in to use our clinical services. And it is for a large, distinguished public university, a remarkable number of students, a remarkable percentage of students. And what this says to me is that students of different identities see the services that we provide as essential to their success academically, essential to their personal and relational health and progress. And it's really heartening on the one hand and exhausting on the other hand. So that's my introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. I want to really focus on a couple of things that I think are essential for you all to leave this space with, and hopefully in the course of this conversation, this will become abundantly clear from all of us. First, that there is on our campuses now a true continuum of care that exists to serve students at many points of distress or dysfunction or actual mental illness. An entry into that true continuum of care differs for individual students, and much of those, the decision point for each individual student on where in the continuum they will enter into some kind of care is dependent on identity and what aspect of a complex identity maybe is most prominent in that moment developmentally. And it's critical for our campuses to have available an interlocking web of support for students, across student affairs, across academic affairs, so that multiple points of entry can exist for our very diverse students because the chosen point of entry will change for an individual student depending on where they are developmentally in their multicultural, intersectional sense of their own development and identity. So we have to be many things to many people, and I don't know that we can be all things to all people, but we come very close, I think, most of the time, hence our exhaustion. But in fact, we have, I think, come a long ways in the 2.5 decades that I've been in this profession, in meeting students where they are, and meeting students and acknowledging, actually embracing students for who they are fully as human beings, and then bringing to them and engaging with them around effective evidence-based care.
Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Reina Juarez. I am the director of the Counseling Center at UC San Diego. And I wanted to share with you, because we are in the School of Law, a quote that I love. That's the revolutionary, non-compliant in me. And it says, even when the laws had been written down, they ought not always remain unchanged. And that's something that I want us to keep in mind as administrators, as allies, whatever we want to be. And with that, something that comes in my mind for most is that we will have policies, guidelines, procedures for everything, but indeed, I go back that it was in the 1980s when the first guidelines to work in multicultural issues appeared. And it was so wonderful because before that, many of us were doing very creative, innovative things. But one thing then that became very clear to me is that with all those guidelines, with all the scholarly work, with all the research, what we can do then is that subsumize somebody that is different than us, that we do not know that much. We, in the process of trying to help them, we could rob them of their humanity, even when we talk about them. Like some of you who know me, you will know that I have an issue with the word minority. And maybe because I'm Latina, and I know that our numbers are becoming very solid, especially here in California. So when I am at the university, I am always very careful of calling our students underrepresented students, because there should be more of them. And that will be an example, because when we use certain terms, you know, then that can rob that sense of humanity of the individual. Also, something that is going to be very important, if you notice, I am wearing a green ribbon, and there are a lot of them in the front. I spent a couple of hours yesterday night putting it together with much love, because it is a California movement, and we are here in California. And it is for the reduction, to eliminate the barriers that are due to stigma and discrimination. And in our earlier panel, we saw how steel is loud and strong, even among our fields in psychology, psychiatry, mental health. And therefore, I will really encourage for all of us to take one. If you don't want to wear it, take it home, put it on your desk someplace, because this green represents the work that we do with all our multicultural, diverse students, especially those that are struggling with the multiple intersection, where somebody could be a female of color, bisexual. It could be a Wiccan. It could have an appearance, you know, with tattoos, with things that are non-traditional, but at the end, it could be the most wonderful human being that there is, that wants to be seen for what it is. So with that, another thing that I need for us to reflect will be the concept of knowing ourselves. As you can imagine, I love the Greeks. I love thyself, I know thyself is going to be even more important, because it is by reflecting on our limitations, being comfortable with our limitations, and by being able to also live the examined life. In that way, we will continue to grow and expand, and we won't be able to be afraid of saying, I don't know, I really want to learn about you, explain that to me, because in my world that might mean this, but in your world it might mean that. And indeed, none of us wake up this morning saying, today intentionally I'm going to say something that is going to hurt or offend anybody. And I'm going to tell you, by the time that I am finished talking, inadvertently I might have offended or disappointed or upset somebody. And that is unavoidable, but my heart, my intention wasn't there, and I really apologize for that, and that's how we have to live life. We need to dare, we have to be bold, always keeping that humanity of the intersections that we will confront and that we might not understand. So with that, I'll pass it to my colleague.
Good morning, everyone. I am Carla Shird. I am from Gallaudet University. I am a mental health therapist there. I have also traveled internationally all over the United States where I've done presentations about working with deaf patients. I just absolutely love that topic for discussion. And what I want everyone to learn is that culture for deaf people is not just ASL, which is American Sign Language. There are many times when people hear the word deaf, they automatically assume, oh, that person uses sign language or American Sign Language. That's not true. There's huge amounts of diversity within the deaf community. You have deaf people that use English, that are more oral, that sign in a more English form of sign language. So there's some that are deaf-blind. They need to have tactile sign language where they can actually feel somebody else signing. So a deaf person may actually be Latino. That's part of their identity. It's part of their culture. It's part of how they see the world. Or deaf people who are gay or lesbian. Or deaf of deaf, meaning a deaf person who had deaf parents or deaf grandparents. Their experience will be very different compared to a deaf person who came from a hearing family. There are some families that do not sign or have any communication at all within the homes, whereas if they have deaf parents, there's language from the beginning. I mean, there's a lot of diversity even within that, but what's important is to know that there's so much variation out there. So you can't automatically link the concept of sign language with deaf people automatically. It depends a lot on their experience and who they are today.
That's great. Thanks. And thank you for interpreting. Let me frame this discussion with a couple of comments. As Liz said, there's enormous change on campus. And for those of you who know me, I like numbers, so I want to give you a couple numbers. Mental health providers working at college campuses have to be culturally competent due to the changing American landscape. These changes are reflected in the students who attend our nation's universities. In 1976, 82% of university students were white. A few years ago, in 2008, 63% of the university students were white. And I'm sure that number's dropped. 14% that same year in 2008 were black or African American, up from the 10% in 1976. In 2008, 13% were Hispanic, Latino, and that's up 400% from the 3.7% in 1976. 7% were Asian Pacific Islander in 2008, which is almost 300% up from the 1.8% in 1976. American Indian, Alaskan Native were 0.7% in 1976, and in 2008, they were also up a small amount to 1.1%. But, as you'll hear, and as you've heard, diversity is broader than ethnicity, and numbers don't tell the whole story. I'd like to read you a comment from one of my students. I asked my students in my psychopathology course to reflect on issues of cultural competence in their own personal and professional development. And I'm glad Kirstyn commented on privilege, and Reina encouraged us to know ourselves, because I think this brief comment is reflective of that. And she said, when examining parts of social identity, it's become abundantly clear to me that my own identities play a larger role in my future as a therapist than I used to think. My own personal development has been shaped more clearly the more I expose myself to learning about social identities. Coming to my undergraduate university as a first-year student was an eye-opener for me, a straight, white, able-bodied person coming from a privileged background. It took me less than 2 weeks to have an aha conversation that shook me to the core. I'll never forget it. I was assigned my time to register for classes for the upcoming quarter, which was after some of my peers who lived in the residence hall with me. I I was furious that they had been given priority registration and I wasn't given the same thing. I spent some time being upset with the situation and finally approached my resident advisor about it. I vented. I spouted off how it was unfair and how I was less than thrilled that I was stuck taking a 7:30 a.m., life is hard for undergraduates, 7:30 a.m. chemistry course, while other students got the later, better times. It was then that he shared with me that I was given a lot of opportunities to succeed at college prior to even coming to campus. I was able to take AP classes, had access to resources that many high school students didn't have, and was starting at a totally different place than some students. The notion of an even playing field was not something I've ever learned about before, let alone that not everyone started at the same place on this imaginary but all too real playing field. The idea that I had been given unearned privileges was hard to swallow. It's never easy to be faced with things that we'd like to otherwise forget or pretend we never knew. Not too much longer after that incident, the same resident advisor was the one who challenged students in an incredibly warm and developmental way when a group of us were headed to a program where there was a panel of LGBTQIA community members answering questions from the audience. Walking to the program, a student asked the RA, why wasn't there a straight panel? Why wasn't there a group of straight people who were going to share their stories? And without skipping a beat, my RA said, because every day is a straight panel. In 7 words, he shared with us an invaluable lesson that our society is a breeding ground for dominant identities. It's the subordinated identities that many times get forgotten or don't have the systemic power to have their voice heard. I appreciated my student's comments and think that this student will make a culturally competent therapist because she's willing to look at herself, her privilege, her identities, and their effect on her behavior. And based on her comments, I'd like to ask the panel 2 broad questions, one at a time. First, what do we need to do to train mental health providers to become culturally competent in order to assess and treat today's diverse college students who experience mental disorders that result in personal pain, interpersonal isolation, and academic problems?
So when I first came to my program, they had not taken a foreign graduate, like I am talking about my residency training at Michigan State. So they had not taken a foreign graduate in almost 12 years. So I came to a program where pretty much the whole all the residents were white, much younger in age than me. And that's the first time I realized that it's so difficult coming from another culture to integrate. It's not only about being a good resident or being a good psychiatrist. It's about how you integrate into a system. I realized that we do not talk much about immigration or even the cultural competency policies. I was surprised was based on tolerance, which was like a majority group extending tolerance to a minority group. But on a personal level, I felt it was very insulting, like, you're going to tolerate me for how long? Till the end of this conference, maybe? Well, I was here in America to stay and be part of the program and the country. So I wanted something more than tolerance. And I realized that how a new immigrant is integrated into the society, how they are welcomed, can make or break their lives. So Michigan State University has a lot of foreign students coming in. And still, I think the policies that are there for mental health policies or rules and regulation, they're very formatted or keeping a white Caucasian population in mind, or even an average American child, which, like, talking about privileges, understanding the school system. There is no space still, like, they are working really hard. There is departments, the counseling center, they're dealing with it now. There is change happening, but still I feel like we need to go beyond tolerance to acceptance. So that's the first thing I did, was started a cultural competency program based on acceptance. And when I talk about acceptance, I talk about acceptance, it's a two-way thing. So acceptance actually initially starts with you accepting who you are, being comfortable within who you are, where you are coming from. And in that acceptance, I realized that when we talk of culture, we are still talking about ethnicity, we are talking about race, but we are not talking about religion. And for most of our students, especially if I talk about my Muslim student population, religion can become a source of distress or become a source of resilience, depending on how they have coped with it or how it has been integrated in their life. But I know one thing, that religion is a very central part of who they are. So, but even now, when I'm on a cultural competency panel, I never see religion being mentioned. And when we are dealing with our students or interviewing them, even as an admission form at Michigan State, there's no question about religion. And it's for me, who's working with this Muslim community, even if I have to apply for a grant, I can't even give a number like you, Emil, say, oh, the need is this much, or we have this many practicing or non-practicing, or even identified Muslims. So things like that, like expanding what cultural competency is important, and keeping immigration, keeping religion, keeping cultural heritage, all that should be included, but acceptance is so important. So acceptance of yourself and acceptance of who is coming to you for therapy, for treatment. And acceptance to me is so non-judgmental. I read somewhere, which had stuck in my mind, that our minds are like umbrella. They don't work till it's open. So keeping that acceptance, non-judgmental acceptance is important. And I also realized that stigma of mental health, things are changing. Things are definitely changing, but especially questions like, as a medical student, I'm seeing a lot of medical students. I mentor them and I teach them, and I'm also seeing some of them as my patients. And I realize that they have this huge fear. They will come to you, they will say, hey, Dr. Abbasi, I need you to treat me, but I don't want it going on your record, because I don't want this stopping me from applying in this state or applying for a license or affecting my career choices. Then we have a big section of people going to Army, military services. How are they dealing with it? I mean, there is still not that openness when it comes to military services. So those are the areas that I'm hoping to have more impact on.
But others?
You want us to go in order? Or?
No, just whoever.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, I
whoever
did have
wants
comments,
to.
but we don't have to go in order the whole time.
Yeah. There's no order to this panel.
Okay. There were two things that I think of when the topic of training and education comes up, and at Cal State Long Beach, we're really lucky to have a AP accredited doctoral internship. One is, of course, the individual things that we can do as clinicians or faculty and administrators, but the other, I think, that is not talked about quite as much as it needs to be are systemic changes that are needed. And this is where my love for community psychology comes out. So obviously, as individual supervisors or faculty, there's lots of things to do, and there's always more to do, and that's continuing to challenge ourselves to keep current in our field, to be good allies to other traditionally marginalized groups, to consult with each other and all that. And then on systemic levels, I mean, that really could take so many forms, both at the graduate training level in terms of making sure diversity is infused into all of the classes, not just the one diversity course or maybe two diversity courses. Also making sure that there are practica available at the Jewish Community Center or the LGBT Center or the API Community Center. And then or outreach opportunities at the predoctoral internship level. And then a tricky issue that's been current, at least in California and New Jersey, is some of you may have heard that California, with the support of the California Psychological Association, recently passed a law banning what are called sexual orientation change efforts, which is basically when you take a gay or lesbian or perhaps a transgender person, put them in therapy and try to change them into being straight, which usually just makes their mental health worse. And there's, just to be clear, there's no research that supports that. And APA has come out, really strongly about outlining what are appropriate responses to sexual orientation and gender identity. And then the tricky thing is how to be supportive of religiously affiliated institutions in a way that is still maintaining, what's current in terms of research and best practices with our LGBT populations, which are, a vulnerable population like our other traditionally served underserved populations. So those are a couple of things that I think about. I think it's easy to think about the individual things that we can all do, and perhaps that's why we often feel exhausted, as Dr. Gong-Guy mentioned. But, I think it's something that, especially for those of us who are administrators or in those kinds of positions, to think about systemic changes, but even for those of us who are the worker bee types, how can we sort of bond together and build cross coalition alliances and work together to affect social change for all traditionally underrepresented groups.
Thank you. Thanks. I wanted to say something. Good. Anybody? Okay, so I can. All right. So when we are doing training, I would propose to keep in mind that we examine the whole student. And when I'm talking about the whole student as a person, is that we need to really understand that human being from their history, their background, even the history of their ancestors, because there are many things that shape our worldview, as you know, given where our great-great-grandparents have come from, et cetera, et cetera. And as with the whole person, we need to explore their strength, their social support system. We need to explore their lifestyles. And many times, a lot of our students that have many intersections in their life are also into social justice. They are student activists. And for them, to learn more about all of that and their lifestyle is going to be very important, because we wouldn't want them to burn out. So when we are working on training also, I will always look forward to encouraging that person that has bright eyes, that is full of dreams, passion, to help others also, that we have to find always a way, because we know that when somebody comes with an issue, it's multidimensional. It is not just a few items, factors, and that's it. We also know that as human beings, we have an amazing capacity to be self-delusional. And that's where knowing ourselves is going to be very important, because otherwise we are going to be projecting so much upon the other person, a lot of the things that belong to us. And I think that's very important for our training. And to be very creative, like one thing is you use a word that I love, which is to meet the student where the student is at. It's not just where they are in their life, but physically. We have to get out of our offices. And for our students earlier here, I can say that in a lot of our universities now, we go where the students are. So we hang around in many areas where we know that they will be, whether it's the community centers, whether it's a student life, and we are with them in their lifestyle also. Of course, that another important thing for our training is how not to lose ourselves also. That's where boundaries will be very important, because oftentimes as a psychologist, I have to be fearless. I have to go into that whirlwind of their life, but I always know that I am their anchor, and I have to be my own anchor. So I have to be in incredible shape in order to do those sort of things. But that fearlessness, that if we are afraid of our students or where we will go with them, or what's going to happen to our license, if something goes wrong, we couldn't sleep at night, and we wouldn't be useful, because then we wouldn't be using the procedures and interventions that are really needed, because we are also student-centered. And that is something that is very important, because from my perspective, everybody may flourish. And there will be a lot of people that would say, I don't have a mental condition, who are languishing. Indeed, in the United States, we have an epidemic of people that are languishing. And yet, I do have a lot of my students that struggle with mental conditions that are flourishing, and that's very important. That's why the ribbon that we wear has this beautiful green that I see everywhere, that is now a springtime. That is that ability to flourish.
That's good.
Yeah, I'd like to add on this comment, certainly applies to the deaf population as well in terms of cultural competence. Oftentimes people ask me, how can you best work with a deaf person? And they assume that they should go to take a class. And I always say, well, yes, you can take a class, I mean, certainly for basic information, but what they're forgetting or overlooking is that the class teaches about the white deaf culture, the predominantly white deaf culture, what white deaf people experience, what white deaf people have in their life tracks. And it doesn't necessarily apply to the LGBT community and elsewhere. So if you go to learn basic, what you would learn in that class cannot apply universally to everything. For example, at the dinner table syndrome, I believe that 90% of deaf people experience. And what dinner table syndrome refers to, it's sitting at dinner with your family and everyone is talking a mile a minute, and the person sitting at the table with no access to communication has absolutely nothing to do with the conversation. So everybody's laughing and everyone says, oh, we'll tell you later what that was. You're equated, it's something about the dog. It's just about the dog. So, you know, everybody, oftentimes the deaf person will sort of pretend to participate as though that they're somehow equal. And this is a very, very, very common experience within the deaf experience. It has nothing to do with race, etc. So I would encourage all of you to go and to learn and to meet and to talk to deaf people. Go to their churches, go to their theaters, go to their temples, go to their activities, be a part of the deaf community. That's the very best way. And yet at the same time, you're right about the boundaries. Absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. You know, becoming friends with them, you know, if you fall into that, remember that your role is, you know, the therapist or the mentor or the counselor or whatever that you are. So the best way to really learn culturally is to immerse yourself into it while keeping those boundaries.
I have only irony to share, because I think when I think about multicultural training in our field, I actually focus more on increasing our own experience. Includes the trainees, but I think it has to include the trainers in these situations. That what we're trying to do is increase our awareness of our own intercultural and multicultural incompetence. That the focus is really about understanding and remaining open to the fact that we will never know all that we need to know. Far from it. We won't even know what the questions, what a reasonable set of questions might be to ask. It's taken, I think, a long time for us across many fields, different fields, to understand that the idea of multicultural or cultural blindness, right? To be culturally blind in any situation is really an elaborate mythology. That there is no such thing. You take into account all that you see before you and all that you've brought into the situation before you, the presumptions that you have, the prejudices that you carry, and then see through those lenses. And we have to work constantly at understanding what those lenses are and how they limit our perception of reality. The idea of understanding my own identity is, like, in some ways mind-blowing. Over time, have understood myself very differently, and I would expect that to be true of 100% of the clients that I see ever. And I would expect that in the course of a training year, this is how we approach the world often, that in the course of a training year, that people's competencies and their sense of their own incompetence will change rather dramatically. And that people ending the training year should, if they were honest about their self-evaluations that they turn in at the end of the year, look worse at the end of the training year. Because if the trainings worked the way it was intended to work, you will understand the ways in which you are multiculturally and interculturally incompetent. Now, all of that said, we expect competencies to be mastered in the course of a training year, and that is the hope, and we do that actually quite effectively. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, this intercultural training, multicultural training, really has to happen, I think, over the course of a lifetime, a professional lifetime. And the bigger challenge, I think, is to have that ongoing training in some way institutionalized among those of us who've been sitting in this profession, or not sitting really, but running in this profession for a professional lifetime. So those of us who have been in the field for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45 years, we are the ones who are most multiculturally challenged, I think, much of the time. And getting training to those of us in sort of administrative and kind of somewhat more powerful sometimes positions is the bigger challenge, because that is, I think, where change also does have to occur.
Well, from a student's perspective, I guess is the only way I can speak, because I'm not a doctor, but maybe one day I will be. I think that as far as cultural assessment, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1999, and I went to many doctors, many psychologists, and tried a variation of medications that had me in and out of 5150s and so on. But I have to say that culturally it was very difficult for me to express myself, because I come from two different cultures. My mother is from Guatemala and my father is Jewish. And it was very difficult for me to explain how I was brought up while my father was here in the States with us. And then when he left to Israel, I was brought up in a different cultural environment, which was new to me. We had certain customs and then they changed. And I feel that in sessions of therapy, as you said, God is not really something that we discuss. And I believe it's because, scientifically you guys are doctors in the sciences. But aside from finding the proper medication for me, when I finally found the correct medication, God was a big factor in my life. And only through the grace of God is that I'm sitting here today. And fantastic therapists that I've had through my lifetime. But more than that is, I always felt that I was always placed in a box. And my box was, you're an Hispanic minority that, needs help. And let me see what I can do for you. But in reality, a lot of the times I felt that I was healing myself, because a lot of the questions that were posed to me were questions like, and how does that make you feel? You guys are familiar with that. And so in seeking therapy, I think what was really critical for me to find the therapist that I have today is that she opened up a world of people like Ellen Sachs to me, where I had never heard of anyone with my condition to be successful or to have accomplished anything really in life, much less the Hispanic, I'd be categorized as that female that has a mental disorder that kept me for many years from getting educated. And today I can say that through this great therapist that opened this door to me, I have a sense of pride. I don't feel as a minority anymore. Thank you, Dr. Juarez, for that. I don't feel as a minority anymore. I know who I am. I know my capabilities. And I have a great support system today in my life that doctors that come in and actually help me heal versus asking me what I need to heal. I don't know. That's why I come to doctors. I know it's ironic. But more than that is, I believe that in the profession of psychology and psychiatry, it is very critical to be able to understand where a patient comes from, because some of the hurts and pains that I had as a child were devastating, traumatic experiences that I had, that at times I believe doctors forget that some of these things, especially culturally, like my father would never allow me to speak on these things, and my mother wouldn't either. In therapy, it's very hard for me, to be able to disclose these things, and one, not feel judged, and two, not feel that I'm saying things that are going to make this person disgusted with me. And so I am very cautious, and I have always been very cautious, because some of the times when I opened my mouth, I ended up in the hospital for a 3-day vacation. But so that is very crucial when doctors are speaking with people like me, because we do not easily open up. And the times that we have opened up, we do end up, in a hospital bed. So culturally, we cannot speak. We're told not to. And then at the doctor's office, when we do speak, we get in trouble. And so it's very frustrating to help doctors help us, because I know they want to help, but when they're told that if we say we want to hurt someone, we end up in a hospital strapped down, medicated, heavily medicated, that doesn't make you want to talk anymore. And coming here, actually, I thought about it, but I'm so grateful to be here, because I think person with mental illness perspective is really important for everyone to know what goes on in the minds of us people. Thanks
very much. I really appreciated I really appreciated the comments of Michelle and Evan and Nadine's facilitation of that, and I wrote down a number of questions, and so I'd like to ask you one of the questions that was stimulated by that conversation. Students with mental disorders need a safety net. Evan and Michelle discussed resources, and Brenda just added a couple, God and mentors, and Michelle and Evan talked about social support, medication, therapy, and self-care. And so I wonder how mental health providers can better help clients access useful resources, because I think that doesn't happen as much as it should.
I actually do think that a big part of a student coming into treatment has to be about psychoeducation, about how to use our system in the ways in which it might exist. On campus, it's sometimes an easier discussion, because we know that we have a breadth of resources, or at least, UCLA and a lot of other campuses, we have a lot of resources. We can talk about those resources. There's a real place. There's a way to gain entry. There's an intentional onboarding process where you access services and you can get into services and out of services back into a more kind of generally supportive environment on campuses. Most students don't stay on campus for their entire lives, but that training to access service beyond student life, I think, is a critical part of the education that sometimes doesn't get addressed at the front end, and we don't always see students all the way through their academic career at the counseling center, certainly, but in other services as well. So I actually think that the campus has a job to do in organizing for students who may eventually leave campus and need to access resources off campus. And that transition is probably also part of our job on campus. So we'll just take on another thing. But I think that's essential because it's not necessarily part of how we see ourselves on campus.
I believe that to really be of assistance, we have to work like a well-oiled, organized, and connected system where we really have to take responsibility to know about all the available resources or to know people that can help us know of the resources to share and work with the student and to form powerful, I'm not talking even strong, I'm talking about powerful alliance with all the key elements in whatever environment is needed for the students to be well connected. And I believe in walking the extra mile. I believe that in a university, every time that I am with a student, I see like the most precious human being that is in front of me. And because I have been in counseling centers for so many years, a lot of my students, including the ones with the biggest challenges, and just like the heroes around me here, Ellen, Jamie, you know, all the many others, they are physicians, they are politicians, they are everywhere. So I know how vital they are. I see the future leaders, the ones that we can count. Therefore, I am very willing to walk that extra mile. So we cannot be limited by the clock. We cannot be limited because, that's too much work and maybe it's not within my scope or whatever it is. So I see that essential to work as a system where the student is at the center of everything and that's the safety net that you're talking about.
Thanks, yes.
I also wanted to add a couple of things that occurred to me. One is that I noticed that when a deaf person comes to the office, people will say, "Oh, are you deaf?" And they'll kind of freeze a little bit, like, "I don't know what to do with you, teach me your culture," or things like that. And the deaf person feels like, okay, I came to get here for help. I didn't come here to talk about culture and explain it. So there's a little bit of rejection. "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know sign language. I can't help you." And that person is shown the door. And so it's ultimately everyone's responsibility for you to educate yourselves to know that it's okay to, does your school provide a sign language interpreter? Or, you could contact Gallaudet University. We have tons of resources ourselves. Or CSUN as well. They have a huge deaf community and support system provided there as well. And Rochester School of Technology, RIT in New York, they have a huge deaf community there as well. So there are other colleges and community colleges, for example, in Texas. They're out there if you look for them. So don't put all the responsibility on the deaf person at the first session and, tell me about your hearing loss and all of that. You don't have to go that direction. I'm trying to remember what my second point was. Oh, yes. My experience going at Gallaudet University, to a lot of people that means you have really good, easy access to communication. But when I was going through intakes, where I interview the students, well, why come for counseling? A lot of times they'll ask me, well, are our counselors good signers? And that means, are they really truly fluent? Are they going to be able to understand me? If not, we have interpreters that are qualified, who are certified, not meaning in the mental health sense qualified, certified. But for example, a few months ago, my client needed to see a doctor at Gallaudet. An interpreter was provided, and the interpreter misunderstood the client, and they thought that the client had said they were suicidal. And this person was being ready to be sent to the hospital, where we have to look at the history. The client has had a bad history of being misdiagnosed, so it's part of the system. And so finally, here's the first person she trusted and felt like she could trust me, when two of us together could go see the doctor. So I was able to resolve that issue, but it all came back to the interpreter. The Gallaudet provide that interpreter, but that wasn't resolving the communication issues that were happening.
Thanks. Let me ask you, move to another question that I've gotten from the participants here. So let me just read this. So the focus seems to be on how diversity impacts mental health. But how do we think about mental health as an element of diversity as well? What might that change? What are the potential implications?
I think what we have to realize is mental health is there is a concept of mental health versus a concept of mental illness. So like any other field, psychiatry and the mental health is moving towards a preventive approach as well. But definitely when you are suffering from a mental illness, it's very isolating. And it almost becomes a part of who you are. It defines everything you are doing. It affects your relationship, your academic choices, your health issues. So definitely it's part of who you are. I think the more we have awareness about mental illness and mental health, the more we would be accepting of the diversity that the mental illness brings. How I approach, definitely we at Michigan State are seeing more and more students accessing care. I don't know if it is because we have now parity and we do the change in health law. More and more students are staying on their parents' insurance, are accessing care more. And we do have prepaid appointments and 25 free sessions and stuff. But definitely, I think it is important to deal with mental illness starting from an individual level, and spreading it out to the community, their resources, the resilience, all that. I think it starts centrally focusing on the person's weakness, strength, resilience, what works, what does not work. I always start with my students because what we are seeing, a huge, like all of us who work in student health know that there is a huge issue of substance abuse. So somebody who's depressed or anxious, it's easier for them to go towards substance use versus coming to some healthy resolution of dealing with it. So keep starting there, like what's working for you, what's not working for you, starting with the individual. Then who are the people who are important? Is it roommates, friends? What is the social network? Are you associated with any groups? Do you volunteer? Who are your friends? What kind of peer groups you are identifying with? So we at Michigan State, the student psychiatry unit works really close with the counseling center, with the international students, with the LGBT resources. We all weekly meet and exchange and discuss. Then we also bring in the police and the security forces. So there is constant reviews that happen. And then in case of somebody like coming from like particular religious community, I always encourage and get them to bring those resources in. So kind of it's a ripple effect, but very important is starting with the student. Are they eating healthy? Are they sleeping? Sleep has become a cornerstone of the treatment because what's the first thing they compromise as a student is the sleep. They don't sleep, they have erratic sleep hours, and sleep can become a huge thing. So regularizing sleep, food, nutrition, exercise, and then taking it forward. So I hope I kind of answered.
Let me add something to this question that is, I just got 2 questions on it, actually. And so let me read them both to you. Do you perceive a culture of people with lived experience as consumers of mental health services? What role do you see for student peers in your program? And then this other question is, we've heard about the role of doctors, therapists, counselors, medications. What about peer support? Can the panel speak to the importance and use of peer support specialists?
So can I roll up those 2 questions with the previous question?
Yes, right.
Because in fact, I think peer support is an essential part of what it is that every campus offers everyone. I mean, it's like the reduction in, or the potential for a reduction in isolation of an individual that is experiencing some aspect of mental illness is enormous, enormously protective. And because I think of, and a lot of the people that I work on campus with think of mental illness as just an element, a complex element, potentially, of an individual's identity, and it is a protected element of that individual's identity that's variable over time and depending on treatment and responsiveness to treatment and a lot of other variables, that the environment that a student is seated in matters a lot. And peers being well educated on how to be supportive and how to recognize when a friend or a roommate is needing more support, potentially more professional support, that's actually an important part of undergraduate, graduate, and professional education now. There are very few students who are able to get through entry to college and out through, graduation at any level without encountering a lot of people that have all kinds of mental illness or who have varying levels of mental health across time. We don't speak, I don't know, anybody in my counseling center doesn't really talk that much about mental illness publicly. We don't actually even talk about mental health publicly. We talk about strength, we talk about resilience, we talk about wellness skills, we talk about life skills, we talk about all kinds of other things because of the stigma attached to the language of mental health and mental illness, those being now equated, mental health and mental illness. So it's like you find some, so at some point wellness, probably next week, wellness is also going to be part of the stigmatized terminology, and we'll find something else. I think resilience is the next one. But we do have to have some language, and peers need to have that language, and peers need to be able to not use stigmatizing language. And we have a role in providing that to peers and also to faculty and to staff.
If I may add to this, it took me 10 years to get my Associate of Arts degree, just so that you guys can know that. Mainly because I was in and out of hospitalization, but also it became very difficult to finish classes when there wasn't much of peer support at my junior college. What I did notice is that there are not many clubs to be part of, to integrate into the college life for students in general, much less older students such as myself. But so the transferring to the university was probably the most difficult stage transition of my academic journey. Aside from being an older student, I'm also a widowed mother. And I live in Los Angeles, and I chose Cal State Long Beach because I felt such serenity when I visited their campus that I had to go there, aside from UC San Francisco, which is where I also got accepted, but I couldn't afford the cost of living there. One of the resources that I needed to find was housing for disabled students and their children. And I guess out of all of the resources that I needed, that was the most important, because I didn't want my daughter to be without me during my schooling time. Another thing that I do find is that in resources, through my life, I guess I didn't realize whenever people would discriminate against me. Mainly because I guess I wasn't educated. But in getting educated recently, I've discovered that there have been a lot of biases and a lot of discrimination, even amongst the professional staff that I seeked, which the resources that I guess should be in place is resources of the legal factors, such as criminal defense and civil litigation defense. Right. I've been a victim of both. And in those circumstances, if I ever felt alone, those were the times. Diversity in mental health, none of my psychologists have ever looked like me. And none of my psychologists can truly understand what I go through or what I went through unless they went through it themselves. And I think that the strength and the resilience that the panel's speaking of comes from my cultural background, where I come from two cultures that are fighting people. I come from the Mayans, and I come from the Israelites. These are two very, very strong people that I'm combined with. And I believe that through those two things is that I am who I am today. But also, when I did have incomplete terms at school, it was very difficult for me to reinstate myself into the college life and the routine because I had been out. Financial aid was also very damaging to me because, as you all know, there's only a certain amount of time that you get that. And unfortunately, when I did try to get Social Security disability insurance, I was told that I didn't qualify because if I can sit in a classroom, I was fine. And there was another discriminatory, I guess, action against me, where I live on welfare. I get $516 a month, aside from my financial aid, to support my daughter and I, both of us through school. My daughter is my pride and joy. And I do worry sometimes whether she will end up having my illness as well. But one of the things that get us through is the ability to be together. And so housing was very important to me, and there aren't any. And so I guess that's pretty much covering all of the questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I just wanted to echo Brenda's comments about the importance of thinking about culture as a resource and a source of resilience, and perhaps there's indigenous healing practices as well as a source of minority stress. So I think that was a really good point that you brought up. And with that, wanted to, again, try to echo Dr. Abbasi's comments about trying to get at these issues from multiple angles, because that's what campuses are supposed to be good with, as long as we keep an eye on our organizational silos. But I know on a lot of campuses now, it's been really exciting to watch the movement of student organizations like Active Minds, right, that are very, or NAMI chapters or National Alliance of Mental Health chapters. So it's been really nice to see students be able to find support from each other and to get faculty and staff advisors to show support for that. So thinking about an ecological systems model, if I could go nerd for a minute, thinking about that at the individual level, and then it's been exciting also to see more campuses having what are called allied training programs. So we started with Safe Zone for LGBT individuals. Now there can be AB 540 for those of you who are from outside California. That's our state law that allows undocumented students to come to college, to California colleges. And even lately, sometimes, I know at our campus we have a new autism allied training program that our Disabled Student Services program runs. It was great because they had our campus law enforcement come as well, so they would know how to be safe, but to react appropriately and be supportive of the student while doing their jobs. And then, of course, at the mesosystem levels, programs like DSS, or there's queer studies programs, Chicano Latino studies programs, Muslim studies programs. And then again, I wanted to just emphasize, I think it's easy to forget the institutional level. I'll say the reason I brought up privilege so early is I've been very humbled by some of the undocumented students that I've worked with lately. It's been amazing to see the shift in their mental health with the passage of the deferred action laws. So, I mean, it's always hard to get people mental health resources when they're uninsured. But, I think I was really struck and moved by some of the challenges just in terms of, well, there's no driver's license, or if they drive without a license, what would happen if they got pulled over? Is it safe to come out as undocumented to the psychiatrist? How would they pay for that? They can't get insurance. They're working a 40-hour job to support their college education because they're not eligible for student aid. So, that's just another way in which these layers of identities can really affect someone's mental health, increasing their minority stress, but also affecting their access to services. So again, just wanted to echo some of the other presenters' comments about the importance of looking at this from a systemic level. but also doing so in a way that's really respectful of people's cultures and their multiple identities as sources of strength and resilience, as well as potential challenges.
I'm sure all the campuses have as a resource center for persons with disability. We have care managers. So we have tried to develop a network around our students so that they have a lot of resources. Just talking about the culture, and talking about the undocumented workers, then there is another aspect of what we are, the Muslim students are facing of, so there is a strong FBI presence on campuses, which not many people are aware of till you run into some situation. So that's another aspect that I'm dealing with, the sense of insecurity in Muslim students, born Americans or who have just immigrated or are just there for educational purposes. So terrorism has entered our lexicon as part of a mental health trauma. So that's another aspect that I have to be cognizant of when dealing with my students.
Good. We have a number of questions left, and we may not be able to get to them. We have about 10 minutes left on the panel. So I'd like to read you another question that I just received. We've not talked very much about the role of class, socioeconomic status, in experiences of mental illness and mental health. Class as a dimension of diversity often goes unmentioned. Can you give me your thoughts about why this is the case, and or the role of class in mental health?
I would like to respond to that question. I think that class is vital, and it remains quiet, and it's not given truly what it deserves in attention, because like everything, when we're talking about higher income individuals, families, what we're talking about is more resources. One of the biggest disappointments for me is that in the past, going to a hospital was not just to keep somebody safe. It was really to have interventions. It was really to help that person have a sanctuary where they were going to also learn certain skills. So it wasn't just about medication, but about other resources when they went out. Right now, with our students, what is very hard for me is that when we send them to the hospital, they might be turned around in 24 hours. Even their medications, if they are given medications, are not stabilized. But I do know that for those who have resources, whether it's an eating disorder or a bipolar or chronic condition, those can buy programs where they can be there for 1 month, 3 months. For eating disorders, there are many, many wonderful places where people can ride horses, they can climb mountains, they can do all sort of things to write their self-authorship again. And we have the Many-Year Foundation, but when you ask me how much does it cost for one individual to go there for 1 day, how many could really be there? So unfortunately, money can buy the best treatment, can open doors through influence, connections, contact, and what really worries me is students like you were talking about, Brenda, because we know that from housing to safety, especially if they have a family, it is vital. So it has to be put on the table.
Yes. Yes, Carla.
Yeah, you ask about class, and that impacts me because I've noticed that in the deaf community, when most of it's our class reputation. For example, Deaf of Deaf, as I mentioned before, with mental health within the deaf community, that we want to protect, Deaf of Deaf want to protect their parents' reputations. You know, our parents graduated from Gallaudet University, or they were the president of a certain deaf club or whatever. So it's really about reputation more so than class within our community. And oftentimes people will refuse treatment, refuse going to the hospital because their family will try to protect them, or the students themselves that don't want to embarrass their family because their family is known. They may have the resources, they may have the class resources, the access, the financial resources, but whereas a hearing person, who is a child of deaf parents, CODA, child of deaf adults, feeling within the deaf community, may feel that they cannot interpret because they're afraid that they may know those deaf clients that go there. So there's a big protection of reputation that impacts all of this, more so than class.
Let me ask another question. As a white straight male, I've struggled to find my voice in discussing aspects of diversity and multiculturalism with my clients and colleagues. Do you have any advice that might help me better lean into this discomfort?
I think that it's essential knowledge for any of us in the helping professions to understand stereotype threat, to understand microaggressions, to understand in communication the nature of rupture and the nature of repair, and to become competent in those, to be knowledgeable and competent in applying all of those concepts. You know, critical race theory is not something that most people run to first in education, and it's just not a part of our typical education. It's not like world history used to be. But in fact, critical race theory matters in how we see the world and how we interact with our peers and those who we serve.
As a psychiatrist, how I approach it, and I think it can apply to anyone providing mental health. So there's always a science to it and there's an art to it. So you need to know your knowledge, but you need to have the heart to apply and interact with your patient. And I've seen that if you care, your patient can perceive it. And then they don't see you as white, black, male, female. They see you as someone who cares, to whom they matter. So remembering that you are their safe place and approaching it with compassion, care, I think in the end, to care is to cure. And I think that's the biggest, privilege for a mental health provider, that we and of course, like you said, that's why we are exhausted and burnt out, and we have to be cognizant of the boundaries. But once you are able to convey that care to your patient, they don't see who you are. They are just seeing someone who cares. So that would be my take on that.
And I have a quick suggestion.
Sure.
I really appreciated, I wanted to say the openness from which that question came. I think what's worked for me so far, and obviously this is a lifetime learning process, is what I find helpful is to make a structural change at whatever level I can at different times in my life. And by that I mean, so for example, we have an LGBT faculty and staff advisory board on our campus. And there's a straight ally, one of my faculty members, colleagues from an academic department. And she's been a member of our advisory board for a couple years now. And I've never really said, why do you need to do this, whatever, but she's made that very clear herself. This is something that she's very passionate about. She sees it as intersecting with her feminism and all the things that are really important to her. And so, that's just a structural change that she has built into her schedule. Once a month she comes to the meetings. She learns by being there. We get her support. We get her connections in the women's studies department. And if there was something that came up with one of her students, she already has the knowledge from being at those meetings. And also she has the connections and the relationships to call upon us if she needs extra help. Mm-hmm. And and this is something that I need to do more of. But one thing that came to my mind on my end is, I don't know if folks remember, but a couple years ago, the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, made a public statement on same-sex marriage, and I was so moved by that. And I'd heard that a number of churches, not all, but there were a couple of African American churches that were really upset about that. And I'm thinking maybe they came around since then. And so people were dropping their NAACP membership. And then listening to NPR on the way to work, I'm like, why don't I join the NAACP? Like, I'm supportive of those issues. I want to learn more. And it is a challenge. I get their magazine. I'm so excited, and I love reading it. And there is some emotional discomfort, as the questioner mentioned, where I'm learning about things that I didn't know about, and I have to confront my privilege, and I have to think about that, and it challenges me. But it's so important, and I'd like to do more as time progresses. But I think those kind of built-in structural changes adds the challenge, but also the support from our colleagues, from like-minded colleagues who share those same goals.
If I may. Please. In response to the question by the white male who's interested in, I think, well, first and foremost, let me say that the person who actually got me on the correct medication and was able to break through all of the barriers that were created in my mind that were sabotaging me was a white male. Mm-hmm. And he, I wish I could find him again. I can't even remember his name anymore. But he would ask me questions about my culture. And he would show up telling me that he learned this about my culture and actually taught me things that I didn't know, which is how I knew that the Mayan and the Israelites were so strong. But because he told me that. And one of the things that he kept telling me is, you're a very strong person, and you are of will, and you are of superior will, and that nothing could ever deter me from living a life of prosperity and success. That, here was this white man that I did not identify with that planted this seed as other white men in my life, like Dr. Whitehead right here, that is huge inspiration at Cal State Long Beach for me. And that I looked up to, and I will always look up to. And I think that if you integrate yourself into our cultures without any bias, discrimination, or judgment, I think you will find that we're actually pretty amusing and and not as scary as people think, I recently learned a word called intersectionality. And I learned that our government structure is set up so that we do have separation, and we do have judgments, and we do have biases, and we do have discrimination. But, if we erase those lines and we become the melting pot that we were meant to be so that no one can see your color, you're just meshed together, I think this could be a wonderful world in which all of us can give something and take something and just be able to live in unity.
Thanks. Thanks. We're out of time, and I'd like to end our conversation today with a quote from John Wesley, who died in 1791, but his words ring as true today as they did in the 1700s. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, for as long as you can. Thank you very much. And I want to thank Ellen and the Institute for having us on this panel.
I just don't know what to say after that panel other than thank you so much, all of you, for your work and what you've done and what you've shared with us this morning. Dr. Kaslow just had something that she would like to do before we break for lunch.
Well, I want to echo the thank you to the members of the panel. It was really very inspiring and enlightening, and thanks to each of you for your honesty and openness and for the amazing work that you do. One of the special treats that I have as being president of the American Psychological Association is to honor people who have really made a difference. And sometimes those people are indeed straight white men. And straight white men who have the courage to lean in and to make a tremendous difference in terms of college and university student mental health. And one of those incredible individuals is Emil Rodolfa. The Americans, you want to come up? The American Psychological Association presents this presidential citation to Emil Rodolfa, PhD, for ensuring that training.
You outed me.
I outed you. For ensuring that training in applied psychology meets the highest standards for the profession and for those who seek psychologist services. A consummate scholar, Emil Rodolfa, PhD's efforts to identify the competencies related to training and credentialing have contributed significantly to the field. His favorite contribution is the, quote, CUBE model. A tireless teacher, researcher, and mentor, he brings an undying passion and energy to the field. He has published extensively and presented nationally and internationally on competencies, supervision, and college mental health. President of the Association of Counseling Center Training Agencies, ACTA, Chair of the Association of Psychology Postdoctoral and Internship Centers, APIC, and President of the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB. He is the founding editor of the APA APIC journal, Training and Education in Professional Psychology. During his tenure as Director of Training and Director of the Counseling and Psychological Services, CAPS, at the University of California, he received awards from training councils, APA's Board of Educational Affairs, ASPPB, and APIC. Congratulations.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
That's for keeping quiet and letting us talk.
So we will now break for lunch. There is lunch in the back. For those of you who wish to stay, we will have Chief Thomas and Deputy Chief Adams speak from 12:45 to 1:15. The Session 3 panelists, you have a lunch that is prepared for you, and we will reconvene at 1:30 for our afternoon session.